Yeah. Okay, so we're at 9:03. We're getting a bunch of other people are coming in, so we can officially start the the office hours meeting. I mentioned earlier that the LSP Association is having steering committee meetings, so our numbers may be down a little bit from that, or there may just not be any burning questions that people have, and uh, they're off doing something else. You can prove them wrong by asking really good questions and making them, sad that they missed this. From the DEP perspective, we talked last week about scheduling the advisory committee meeting, and I had said it would be the normal Thursday in this time period. So I misspoke, the more we thought about the more flexible we thought we would become. Partly, you may have heard, over the years that our advisory committee meetings often conflict with the 21J board meetings. And if for no other reason, we have a lot more flexibility doing this remotely, that we're going to find a date and time that does not conflict with the 21J. So, so people that do have obligations to go to both, one of whom is Ken Maurer from DEP, will be able to fulfill all of their obligations. So, so we'll get back to you on that date. It will probably be the usual time, but we'll let you all know. Other than that, the kind of big things that I found interesting this week, there was a big public meeting last night for the Baird McGuire site, Superfund site in Holbrook, that was run remotely, and I think was interesting for a number of reasons. One, EPA nationally is putting a lot more emphasis on public outreach and communication, and this, and I believe each of the regions were asked to identify one project to kind of use as a pilot to enhancing the public outreach. And the Baird public meeting was chosen for that. It included hiring the Consensus Building Institute, CBI, that to kind of help facilitate the meetings, and they also did a great um, online public survey about the issues kind of in the community and about the site, that they were able to then try to cover some of the issues that were raised during the public meeting. And the CBI folks were moderating the meeting as it went on, which was very helpful from EPA's and DEP's perspective, because it allows the agency staffs to focus on the technical aspects of both the presentations and then answering the questions, rather than the logistics, which can be, if not overwhelming, but distracting to try to do both. So I thought it went really well. Baird, as many of you might know, is one of our older sites, and it was particularly sensitive. They were in the, I think it was early 90s, so early on. The part of the remedy was incinerating contaminated soils. That was a bit of a hot point in the community, and I didn't mean that as a pun. So what we heard last night was a variety of concerns, some of which go back to that, in concerns over potential potential exposures, resulting, historic exposures, and the potential kind of health impacts that could be ongoing. They're expressing concerns about cancer rates and the need for a cancer study in the area. So they had those historic concerns. They also expressed kind of concerns about current and future exposures, particularly centered around something that's not exactly site related, but it's site adjacent, which is a proposed solid waste transfer station proposed for an abutting property. In fact, may have a little bit of overlap onto the Baird property. and the potential for disturbing soils and creating exposures there was also high on the list. And perhaps not surprisingly, there are concerns about PFAS, which is actually not a contaminant of concern at Baird, but it's kind of indicative of how the PFAS issue has permeated people's thoughts and concerns, within our little world of site cleanup and beyond, obviously. But that was brought up as well, and all of which kind of was talked about before, after, and during what was the main point of the meeting, which was there's a lot of work, new work being done at Baird. Considering that it's an old site, there was the soil incineration that I talked about, burying of ash, and capping it, on the property, but there's contaminated groundwater that had to still be dealt with. And being a late 80s, early 90s Superfund site, the response to contaminated groundwater was the traditional pump and treat, and which showed in the early years a lot of success, but basically hit started approaching what appeared to be an asymptote, diminishing returns as time went on, and we're not approaching the target cleanup levels for the groundwater. And that's a concern, of course, to the state, because as a fund lead site, the state does the operation and maintenance, and we're paying about $800,000 a year to operate the treatment plant, and there are pieces of that are now also failing and needing to be replaced, so there are capital costs associated with it. So we, DEP, embarked on a project to at least take a look at the site, update the conceptual site model, do a lot of field work, and try to figure out one, exactly what the current conditions are, and then two, evaluating potential alternative supplemental or replacement technologies to deal with groundwater. And after some bench testing, we're ready to go ahead with a couple pilot tests in the field on putting in some remedial additives. The main problem appears to be that there's LNAPL that's co-located with some of the arsenic contamination in the soil, and the biodegradation of the petroleum is helping mobilize the arsenic. So over the next year or so, we're going to be trying some sulfate and nitrate injections to try to address it. They're promising bench scale tests. We're going to do it in the field, and one of the conditions that will have to be imposed is temporarily shutting down the existing treatment plant during that time period. So we wanted to make sure that the community was kind of aware of all the work that was being done, what was being proposed and why, and kind of what kind of testing and monitoring would be taking place to ensure that during this time period, we would not be creating any potential exposures that would be of concern. So that sitting in and listening to the public meeting, that part of it I thought went really well. And of all the things that the community was concerned about, I think the presenters did a great job. It was the site managers are Kimberly White from EPA, Dorothy. Oh, I'm forgetting Dorothy's last name. Ken.
Montoris.
Dorothy's last.
Montoris.
No, Dorothy Allen. Dorothy Allen. See, I often go to Dorothy Montoris, but no, Dorothy, our site manager, Dorothy Allen. I'm getting way too old for this. Where the obvious things, people I talk to every day, I can't remember their last names, would put on the spot. Dorothy Allen is our site manager. She and Kim did presentations, and then we also had a number of presentations from our contractor, Parsons, and they did a great job as well. So that I think the community was left with at least a good understanding of what was being proposed, and they had the opportunity to ask a lot of questions there, but there will also be follow-up questions and answers that EPA will coordinate as we go forward. So that's kind of exciting site work that that we're doing, and it was great to be able to roll that out. When we have links to all of that presentation material, it should be up pretty soon. I can include that and forward that to people. So that was exciting. It made for a long day yesterday, but it was exciting work and different from the usual worrying about PFAS and the other stuff that has become such a great part of our day-to-day life. Other kind of internal things, but I'll just put in plug for our DEP is going ahead with our ceremony tomorrow to recognize our staff that have been working on projects or doing extraordinary jobs over the next year. It used to be called Pride and Performance Awards, but I think it's Performance Recognition Awards now. Because Pride and Performance, of course, becomes an acronym PIP, and we already use that acronym for so many things, including public involvement plans. So that's going to be kind of a nice uplifting ceremony for us to go through and recognize a lot of the DEP staff. The last year has been challenging for them as well for everybody else, and it's good to maintain the things that we've done in the past to recognize people who are doing such great work. I think that's where I'm going to stop. You don't want to hear about our laptops or anything like that. So take questions, or if Liz or Ken or Nancy or anybody else from DEP want to add anything cool or interesting. Nothing cool and interesting from the DEP staff. Okay. Questions from you guys?
Hey, I was wondering, hearing all this about PFAS, and now we've been over a year of required reporting. You probably don't know offhand unless you really are in it. I'm just curious if anybody's made it through the MCP process with a PFAS reportable release from sort of start to finish. Other than, I think I'm familiar with a couple folks who ended through down gradient property status, but wondering, like, because I, not being the technical person, really sort of curious as to how you actually complete that process. I think, Paul, you and I have chatted about it off and on, given sort of the state of what we know about PFAS.
Yeah, you're right. I don't know offhand. I would speculate that the one site that may have, I'm not sure what the status is, maybe Liz does, the tanker truck overturn in Revere that got sprayed with PFAS. So that came in. That was a site, a 2-hour notification. PFAS was, then one of the contaminants, including the petroleum that spilled. Being a spill, a sudden release where things could get contained and quickly assessed, and also that wouldn't have been a GW1 area. I think those are kind of the settings and the circumstances that, if there were any sites that have been able to notify and then close out, I think it would be that type of site. I don't know if that one in particular has closed out yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if it had.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The other, other situations, I certainly could see if people were sampling and notifying, well, if there are PFAS sites in areas that are not GW1, then Megan, then I can see it certainly would be easier to get out. The levels of concern, both in soil and groundwater, would be significantly higher than the 20 parts per trillion that we're concerned about for drinking water. The only thing there is, while those would be easier to get out, they're also harder to get in as PFAS notifications because the reportable concentrations are higher. So I think you might see sites there where people notify for something else, and PFAS is also a contaminant of concern. But then it might not be primarily a PFAS site. It might be driven by petroleum or chlorinated solvent, and PFAS was also detected, but at levels that, since it's not GW1, were did not create a significant risk. The third category of sites would be those sites where it comes in because of groundwater contamination. And there's just like if you have say TC or PC above drinking water standards in groundwater, and you have a big plume and you're dealing with the source and then the residual contamination in the plume, in that way, PFAS is not significantly different from some of those other contaminations. If you're in a situation where you have contaminated GW1 groundwater, particularly if it's being used as drinking water currently, then that's a longer, more complicated thing. And I would, again, reference the pump and treat system we're running at Baird, where it's an old, boring contaminant called arsenic. That pump and treat system was estimated, given the current rates of effective cleanup, we'd have to run it for another couple hundred years. So PFAS in groundwater 1 is different than, but really in some ways not different than any contamination in a GW1 aquifer, particularly where people are drinking the water. You end up with maybe remedy operation status or temporary solutions, depending upon the exact circumstances. So you might get some endpoint, but a permanent solution, no conditions, everything is cleaned up. Those are our long-term sites. So I did, speaking of having kind of numbers off the top of my head, and I did who was it? EBC PFAS thing on Tuesday. And it was on a panel with 6 other state people. And one of the questions they had asked is kind of what the hit rate is for PFAS in public water supplies being tested. So right now, and this data is all, I would highly recommend going to DEP's PFAS page because you can see, and maybe I'll do it while I'm talking, all of this. We're trying to be as, again, public and transparent is the word I want to use for all of this. And the PFAS page is actually, very illuminating. If you Google MassDEP and PFAS, the top hit will be this page. And we try to gather everything together, what it is and why we're concerned about it. And this is the kind of the cool thing that they had added to it, a GIS story map talking about it and the testing that's going on, the free testing program. And what we see here is, do we have dots here? So 370 public water supplies have been tested and the data vetted and kind of gone through all of that so far. And the detections are here. And I think what somewhere in here is a number. There are 36 out of that 370 tested, 36 systems have PFAS greater than the 20 parts per trillion. And it does get complicated some systems have multiple wells, multiple sources. So when I say 20 systems have results above 20 parts per trillion, it doesn't necessarily mean that all of the water has the same elevated level. Some people are dealing with it by shutting off wells, putting treatment on some wells versus and not others. The whole public water supply, distributions, producing potable water is a very complex, complicated process, and there are a lot of options available actually to public water supplies upon finding some elevated levels of PFAS, including things like shutting down wells and mixing and treating and stuff like that. So a lot of the drinking water program is putting a lot of effort into working with each of these communities, evaluating the options, working with them to help them evaluate the options that are available to them, making sure that public notice goes out so that people are aware. Even if the response is to shut down a well, there's certain public notices, public education to let people know that there had been past exposures. So, a lot of work being done, which is one of the reasons why we're really appreciative that the legislature had provided funding for an additional 6 positions for DEP in these tough, or questionable economic times, that we can expand in that area, because there's a lot of work being done out there. And of course, for all of those dots that you see on that map, those 36 systems plus more, there are sources out there that have to be identified, discovered, private wells that might be in the area that have to be evaluated. So it's not just the drinking water program, it then spills over to the 21E program to help out with that. And it is an all DEP process.
But I am familiar with some of that haven't checked it recently, and then the drinking water data that's really very transparent out there,
Yep.
searchable, all those things. But we don't have the same thing with the 21E database. Can't search by PFAS to find every reportable release. Can we?
True. Yeah, our systems are not set up for that. So I'm going to give a little inside baseball of why that is. So our systems were the last significant kind of revisions of our data systems happened probably in the early 90s, early to mid 90s, when as a result of the 21E program being updated, the other systems, particularly so a few years ago, I think I've talked about this, kind of warning people that it's coming. The department got the approval and funding to roll out a major restructuring, redoing, rebuilding of all of our data systems. Because wayside cleanup had jumped into EDEP, which is kind of a separate system from our major tracking system, and EDEP somewhat feeds the EPICS is the name of the base system. Because we had jumped into EDEP and we had all the online forms and people could see our documents, it was felt that we were further ahead than the other programs, and the other programs were really, were not nearly as transparent as we are, so they got priority for being upgraded. So the drinking water program, for instance, because they had obligations to EPA for passing data up, it was relatively easy to then take that standardized data and also make it available to the public very easily. Well, not very easily, but you see what's there. So, Megan, so we are next on the list in sometime probably, I keep saying sometime probably later this year or so, it will finally be Wayside Cleanup's turn to have our old EPIC system eliminated and rebuilt. And one of the things that we want to see in this is kind of better identification of what chemicals are present at sites. certainly at what triggers notification, but what triggers notification is not always what ends up being the driving force in it. And we have to figure out ways to make sure that that information is then kind of put into the system in a way that will be better readable. And part of that may be, how to, what is the transfer process of actual data packages from labs to the LSB and the client to DEP. As you know, that doesn't happen, completely electronically in readable format. You may get a nice electronic report from the lab where you can then dump it into spreadsheets or databases and evaluate the data and make pretty graphs and figures, which you then turn into PDF documents that you send us. So we end up with PDF documents, which in 2009 was great because we could turn around and make that available to the public, but it limits the amount of kind of data analysis that we can do. So that's the inside baseball of why you're seeing you can download from DEP's website a spreadsheet with all of the public water supply sampling results from whatever town or whatever system you're getting your water from. And you can play with that data yourself, and you can't do that for waste site cleanup. So, but we would like, and we would like to see that as much as you would. But we can't pull that out of our systems because it doesn't go into our systems in a format that works like that. Not yet.
Paul, when you were on the PFAS site, I thought you scrolled past a picture of what looked like microwave popcorn.
Oh yeah.
Is that a problem with PFAS? Should I throw out my Orville Redenbacher popcorn?
Well, I can give you two answers to that. My first answer is that I have a box of microwavable popcorn sitting upstairs, and now that you mention it, I'm suddenly hungry for popcorn, and that might be my lunch. So I'm not throwing it away, but I think it has been widely known that food packaging, but particularly packaging that is designed to be waterproof, has been a source of PFAS exposure in the past. I would caveat that there have been great strides made in the last decade or so to reduce that, but it is not uncommon to see, even up to a couple of years ago, to see newspaper articles about how the takeout containers for supermarket X, Y, and Z, and I won't name names, was tested and found to contain PFAS, and suddenly they're great scurrying to remove those waterproof cardboard boxes, which were supposedly so recyclable and compostable and better for the environment, and replace them with plastic containers. And I'm sure longer term, going back to the cardboard ones, but coated with something different, or a wax or something. So it's all moderation, Elliot. If you're eating microwavable popcorn for your afternoon snack every day, I'd say lay off it and go to old school kernels in a pot with a little bit of oil, and make it yourself. And Orville Redenbacher would be happy to provide you with those kernels as well.
Okay, thank you.
But if you're just doing it, once in a while, when somebody mentions it and suddenly you get cravings for microwavable popcorn, then that's what I do. Diversity in all facets of life is good for you.
So I actually have a question about PFAS. I have a site where we're providing bottled water because a number of residents have concentrations of PFAS above the 20 in their wells. And so I did look online, and DEP has a recommended bottled water supplier list. And I kind of looked a little further because the question was, well, how safe is the bottled water? Because bottled water is not tested as much as, say, a public water supply, right? So
No.
when I
Well-
looked online, I was able to find the supplier list. And if you download the Word document where the supplier list is, it does say that bottled water is regulated by state and local authorities. And it gives you a link to look at how it's regulated. And it indicates that a number of things are supposed to be tested once per year. But PFAS is not on that list. I looked pretty closely. I didn't see PFAS on what's recommended to be tested in bottled water. So my question is, this list that was put together was put together in 2019. So, you know, it is, you know, it's a little bit more than a year old now. And, you know, and all the lab reports are 2019. Are we continuously, or is DEP continuously looking at these bottled water companies to make sure that they don't have PFAS in them when we are giving them to people to replace their PFAS contaminated wells?
Probably not 20.
Huh?
Gary, did you have a comment? That might just be random noise. So yeah, so there's a bit to unpack from there. As I brought up that Word document that you noted, and yeah, so the big difference between the December 18th, 2019 and now is that there is an MCL. So to back up a step, our bottled water regulation is far more complicated than the public water supply regulation, in that it also involves the Department of Public Health, because it's a consumer product rather than public water supply. So everything that I say, I'm going to like caveat, and don't believe me because I'm working off my memory here and it's not something I deal with every day. So I could be wrong. So the promulgation of the drinking water standard, I think, is the key difference between then and now. Before the water bottlers were basically sampling for things where there are standards, and that the Department of Public Health did not have the authority to require them to sample for other things. Now that there is a standard, then DPH will be able to regulate and require that sampling, and then have that sample be made available to the public. So there's that aspect of it. Then there are the water bottlers who did sample because they want to let people know that they are PFAS free, and they provided that. And then there also, and I was looking for it online and I didn't easily see it, but I know it was there before, where DEP provides bottled water to homeowners, for where we're doing that function, usually because there isn't a PRP. We have made it a practice to send a bottle of that water to a lab and have it sampled for everything, not just PFAS. I think it's a good standard practice for us. So we've instituted that to let people know that what we are providing them is better than the water that they were previously drinking. So that information is up there. I'm not sure when the last time we tried to stay out of the business of providing bottled water. We're the provider of last resort. But I know that there were several that we tested, most of which had non-detects for PFAS. I do remember that there was one that in fact did have some measurable levels. And that was a while ago, and that would be up there. It wasn't not one I had ever heard of before. Not that I'm recommending water bottlers.
So
yeah.
you test just a single bottle, or do you do this kind of periodically, or kind of randomly?
Well, we don't do ongoing testing for any given site, but as we provide bottled water, and usually, you know, we're using the same contractor, so there's a limited number of suppliers that are in play. You know, as we provide bottled water to other communities or other neighborhoods, other folks, you know, each time we have a new project, we test the water, and that ends up, and the plan is, you know, over time, you end up essentially sampling water from those same suppliers over and over again, you know, as you continue on.
Okay. All right, that makes sense.
So we should be seeing more results from the water, the bottled water suppliers. Also, and this is probably a good source, the state of New Hampshire did extensive bottled water testing a couple of years ago, and found, you know, pretty good results. And I'm acutely aware of that because the one water supplier that they found elevated levels of PFAS was actually from Massachusetts, and that they are no longer providing bottled water. But they, at the time, they were the source for my local Whole Foods brand bottled water. So there is data out there as well.
Right. Okay. Thanks. That answers my question. Questions? I don't know.
Marie, kind of a follow-up question that you and I were talking about yesterday, and this is not a PFAS specific question, but we'll frame it in the PFAS context, is the disconnect between the CEP driver for a residential property, where any detection of PFAS requires mitigation at some level, and then the MCLs, which are the requirements for bottled water in the public water supply. So the way you might address a CEP at a residence would be to provide bottled water. And if the bottled water supplier only has to be less than 20 ppt, could you be in a situation where you're actually providing water that is a higher concentration of PFAS in it than was detected at the residence?
Certainly, that is a possibility. And you're right, this is not specific to PFAS, it's for any other situation. And in fact, one of my earliest kind of realizations of this, you know, came actually well before either PFAS or even CEP. You know, years ago, I was working on a site that had chlorinated solvents in the groundwater affecting people's private wells. And the kind of end result of that conclusion by a sister agency, so I don't get into too much of the details, was to provide hookup to extend a water main and hook this neighborhood up to public water. And the public water was from a neighboring community. Luckily it was adjacent, so it, you know, wasn't outrageously costly to do this. But the adjacent community was taking water from a surface water source, and it was you know chlorinated water with chlorinated byproducts that met the MCLs. But as a risk assessor, looking at the risk from the chlorinated compounds in the contaminated groundwater versus the risk from the chlorination byproducts in the public water supply, it really sometimes raises the question of, you know, are you in fact reducing risk by doing that? So that was, you know, whenever you're providing some other alternative water source, I think looking at what's in that water and evaluating that, and, you know, at its extreme, certainly in the case of CEP, CEP does look at cost benefit as well, and looking at that, and the assumption and the baseline assumption in that is that the water that you're providing while you're figuring out what's going on at the site to reduce or eliminate those exposures actually is better than the water there. And if that is not true, then a couple things can happen. One is checking out the use of a different supplier, but that's something that people ask, and that's why we sample the water for the bottled water that we're providing people.
Even if a long-term solution might be, as you said, connecting to the public water supply, their ongoing solution only meets that 20 MCL or that 20 PPT MCL, or only has to. It might be better, but it only has to.
And the concept of CEP, and to my concept of CEP, what fixes it in my mind is partly, it's not a long-term solution for everything. It's not saying this is, certainly the DEP has the statute 21E has a goal of eliminating contamination down to background where it's feasible. But one of the concepts with CEP is when you first find out early on in the site process that somebody is drinking contaminated water, often at that point, you have one sample, you have two samples, you don't know seasonal variation, you don't know if this is the leading edge of the plume and that they're going to get hit by a huge amount of contamination sometime in the near future. There's a lot you don't know. And what makes CEP make sense to me is, as a risk assessor and as a risk communicator, when you go to a public meeting or you sit down in somebody's home, which we don't do anymore, but you talk with them over Zoom and say, okay, we've tested your water. We found that there's some elevated levels. We don't know what it means yet. So we would like you to continue drinking that water while we figure it out. This may take 3 or 4 years. Good luck with that. So the CEP really is a step early on in the process to try to avoid that awkward conversation where if it's feasible to do, if you know that somebody is drinking contaminated water or breathing contaminated air, things that they really can't stop, it's one thing to say, I'm going to avoid that part of my yard. I'm not going to let the kids play on it. I'll put a fence around it or so they won't come into contact with soil. But breathing air and drinking water are really basic bodily functions that you can't just AUL away. You can't just tell people to stop. And if you find that there's contamination there and it's early on in the process and you don't know everything about what's going on the site and you're not in a position to make comprehensive site decisions and implement a comprehensive solution, then you as a PRP or the licensed site professional or is asking the resident to continue being exposed while work to figure it out is being ongoing. And I think the intent of the statute to certainly go to background where feasible, but to eliminate exposures, to mitigate exposures, are really is the driving force to do something about those exposures where it's feasible. And providing bottled water is relative. I know every cost is a cost, but it's relatively low cost option while you figure out what's going on. And if that's incentive to figure it out faster so that you minimize that bottled water cost, well, that's great too. And that's the thinking behind that. So, and it certainly makes less sense if the water you're providing is worse than the water that they're drinking from their tap, and that's something to consider. But there are a lot of options of bottled water out there. So I don't think that is something that would make you say, oh, I'm not going to provide bottled water. I'm going to provide different bottled water. So
Understood. Thank you.
there's I've been meaning to doing this. My favorite presentation I ever did was back in when we rolled out CEP, and I don't know if anybody but like Liz was around for this. the training sessions that I spoke for like an hour and a half with taking sips from a bottle of vodka that was on the podium. And it actually tied together really well with CEP. And I've been thinking I should do a video with that one of these days before I forget what the whole point and how it played out. But yeah, maybe they'll do that this week. But if you can figure out how drinking from a bottle of vodka during a presentation ties into CEP, then send me an email and you'll win a prize. Any other questions? That was a good one. And really not specific to PFAS. No. Okay. Everybody does remember that Monday is President's Day and that you're mostly shouldn't be working. Certainly, those of us who are working for the state, it is a holiday. Take it off. Don't inadvertently sit down at your computer and start in on Monday. And also, you may want to remember that Sunday is Valentine's Day. Easy to forget these things as every day rolls into the next. So if there aren't any other questions, Marilyn,
No, I was just thinking, just to put in a plug, and folks who are on the LSPA mailing list should have already gotten an email about this, but in case you stick those in a folder for perusing later, sort of as a thank you to everyone for a year of pandemic and the switch to having to do all of our member meetings and trainings and everything, remotely and via Zoom. The LSPA is offering a $50 credit discount towards, participation in member meetings or towards an online course or an upcoming class to its members. And there's a discount code for that, but it's tied to our fiscal year, so it does expire at the end of June. So just a plug, for those people who are LSPA members, get your discount and take advantage of it before it expires at the end of June.
use it for that great online PFAS course.
That's true. You could use it towards that great online PFAS. Right. But it's just a way of saying thank you for everyone for putting up with us through this transition, which I think has gone incredibly well. We have been able to offer nearly as many credit hours, seat hours as we had previously, and doing it all remotely. So yeah. So anyway, get your $50 off. Use your discount code before it expires.
Okay, well, it looks like everybody is running from the chat. So time to sign off. We'll be back here next week, I think. Yes. Even though it's school vacation week. Are they still doing that? I don't know. Okay, well, if you're doing school vacation things, have fun. If not, we'll see you on Thursday. Have a good week.
Thank you.
Bye.